What's up, guys? So today we're going to do something different for advanced training techniques. Usually we're in the gym, so we're talking about weight training techniques. Obviously we're not in the gym today. We're here in my kitchen at my house, and we are going to go ahead and talk about cardio for fat loss. So right now I'm preparing to compete in a physique competition at the Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio. I've got about 5 weeks to go. So I've been getting a lot of questions about what I'm doing for cardio for fat loss. Do I do steady state cardio? Do I do HIIT cardio? So I figured this would be a perfect opportunity to go ahead and jump into that and talk about what kind of cardio I do and why I do it. So with that being said, let's jump into it. I've been wanting to do a video like this for a while because I feel that there's a lot of misinformation out there when it comes to steady state cardio versus HIIT training. And it seems like this same information keeps recirculating. If you go to Google or if you go to YouTube, you see the same types of articles and information out there, which basically goes something like this. Steady state cardio is a waste of time. Who wants to do hours on hours of cardio on a treadmill or an elliptical when instead you could do something that's much more time efficient, something that burns more fat, and that's in the form of HIIT training or high intensity interval training. So I don't want to try to convince you one way or the other. I just want to provide you with some good information and let you guys decide for yourself. So I actually have something here on the whiteboard. On our left here, MISS. Typically what you would see is LISS, which would be low intensity steady state cardio. But we're not talking about low intensity, we're talking about moderate intensity steady state cardio. So that's where the M comes from. So what is moderate intensity steady state cardio? Well, that's what you're typically familiar with. That's getting on the elliptical machine, or maybe it's the treadmill, whatever it is, and that is elevating your heart rate and maintaining it for whatever that is, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and beyond. So, what is moderate intensity? Well, that's going to be 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. So, for someone who's 25 years old, that's going to be roughly 117 to 136 beats per minute. So, PE, that's perceived exertion. So, that's going to be about a 6. So, what is a 6 on perceived exertion? Well, the old saying goes something like this. If your friend was next to you doing cardio, you could carry on a conversation if you wanted to, but you really wouldn't want to. Meaning that you would become out of breath if you were trying to carry on a conversation. So, moderate intensity. Now, when I see most people doing cardio, I don't think they're hitting this target. What I see most of the time is people on there kind of doing it lackadaisically. So instead of this 117 to 136, most of the time what I see is probably if they had a heart rate monitor, they're probably about 95 to 100 beats per minute. So in order to make this effective, that's the first thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that you're in this target zone right here. And we'll talk later on about what those ideal zones are and why. But right now we're just going to go through the bullet points here. So it is primarily aerobic. So we're going to talk later about the metabolic pathways. There's 3 metabolic pathways, this being primarily aerobic. It's going to use type 1 muscle fibers. So those are your slow twitch muscle fibers, which are your endurance muscle fibers. Primary source of fuel, that's going to be lipids, fats. That's a good thing. That's exactly what we want, right? We want to burn fat as a source of fuel. The last thing down here at the very bottom is EPOC, EPOC. Now, EPOC is something that when you look at the articles on HIIT training, or maybe you watch something on YouTube, you're going to hear a lot about EPOC. So we're going to jump into that here shortly and really dispel some of the myths there, because I think this is one of the biggest ones out of them all when it comes to the debate between high intensity interval training versus steady state and which one is better. So this one is one that I think the facts on paper look a lot better than they are in reality. So now coming over here to the other side, HIIT, obviously high intensity interval training. So in order to make HIIT work, again, I think that where people fall short with HIIT is they're not hitting the right targets. So intervals, typically you're gonna see anything from a 1-to-1 ratio. So let's say that you do 30 seconds of high intensity. Well, then on your low intensity, you're gonna do 30 seconds. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Maybe it's a minute to a minute. Some people are gonna recommend a 1-to-2 ratio. So if it's 1 minute of high intensity, then they'll do 2 minutes of low intensity. So we'll talk about that later as well. But on your high intensity, that's 80 to 95% of your max heart rate. So in other words, if it's that same 25-year-old individual, that's 156 to 185 beats per minute. So to give you an idea of the perceived exertion, that should feel like a 10. That's when your lungs feel like they're gonna explode. That's what high intensity feels like. And most of the time when I see people doing HIIT training, they're not reaching that kind of intensity. So that's a big mistake that I see with HIIT training. Now, on the low side, as you come down, it's that interval training coming high and then low. So on the low side, or let's call it kind of that rest phase a little bit, that's 50 to 60% of your max heart rate. So that's coming back down to 97 to 117 beats per minute. So again, we'll break out the differences and we're gonna compare these side by side, but just wanna go through the bullets. Now, as far as your metabolic pathway, this is gonna be a combination between aerobic and anaerobic activity, and I'll explain why a little bit later. Now, instead of just type 1 endurance muscle fibers, we're also engaging type 2, which are your fast twitch muscle fibers. So we're using both type 1 and type 2 in HIIT training. So the type 1, that's on those lower phases, those rest phases, and as we bring the intensity up, we're gonna start engaging some of those type 2 muscle fibers. Now, as far as fuel source, over here, our primary source of fuel was lipids or fats. When we come over here into high intensity, when we reach those peaks, not only are we going to be burning fat, but we're also going to be burning more glucose. So over here, you're always going to be using a little bit of glucose as fuel, but we're using more glucose as fuel over here in HIIT training, meaning carbohydrates. So last, again, we talked about EPOC. That's going to be roughly double. These are estimates, and that's what the C is for, roughly. So roughly 7% here, almost double, so about 14% here. We're going to talk about that next, and I'll really explain what EPOC means and what the difference between the two is. And this really is the source of all the debate between HIIT and steady state cardio. So let's talk about EPOC now. So what is EPOC? EPOC is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that in a bout of exercise, your body has to restore itself back to its resting state. And in that process, it's going to replenish fuel stores, cellular repair, meaning recovery, anabolism, meaning maybe building muscle. In other words, all those things require energy, or at the end of the day, burn calories. So, what's the argument with EPOC as it pertains to HIIT versus steady state? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because if you look at the studies that were done, they concluded that EPOC for HIIT training was higher than it was for steady state cardio. So you notice on our first side-by-side comparison, we had 7% versus 14%, meaning that with steady state, you burned an additional 7% of calories after exercise. Now on HIIT training, after exercise, burn an additional 14%. So that sounds great, right? So there's been this big argument of, hey, do HIIT training and you're gonna burn all these extra calories while doing nothing. You could sit there and play video games or watch TV, and if you do your HIIT training afterward, you're gonna burn all these additional calories. Well, let's break that down with some math, and you guys are gonna see that it sounds a lot better on paper than it is in reality. So let's break that down. Okay, so now some people call EPOC afterburn. That's how some people refer to it, and you hear them say, well, with HIIT training, you're gonna have double the afterburn or double the EPOC that you would with steady state cardio. And that's the advantage of doing HIIT training. But so here we got the numbers broken out. So let's say that you burn 300 calories during your actual steady state cardio session. So with an extra 7% after your workout session, that only equals 21 calories. So now we come over to HIIT, and it's this big, double the number of calories EPOC. So 14% versus 7%, that's a whopping 42 calories. Okay, so this whole concept of burning extra calories after workout really isn't so significant. You're gonna burn most of your calories in the actual workout session, not afterwards. So when you hear people talk about EPOC, it really is insignificant in the grand scheme of things, because an extra 21 calories isn't gonna make or break your diet, I promise you. So if we're going to compare HIIT training versus steady state just based on EPOC, the argument doesn't hold up. So now the question comes down to, how many calories do you actually burn during your workout session in HIIT training versus steady state? Because people will say that HIIT training is more time efficient, that you're gonna burn more calories in a shorter period of time. So let's look at that next. Let's compare HIIT training to steady state cardio during the actual workout, because we're seeing now that that's what really matters, is how many calories you burn in the workout, not so much after exercise. Okay, so looking at this little graph here. So on one side, we've got intensity. So we've got maximum heart rate. So 50% of max heart rate, 60%, 70, 80, 90, 100. Over here, we've got time, so the duration of your cardio session. So with the dotted line, this would be our moderate steady state cardio. So I went ahead and I put it at about 75% of max heart rate. Now, our line that jogs up and down, that's our high intensity interval training. So on the low end, you see down here, we've got about 50% of max heart rate. So that's our low end of our high intensity interval training, coming all the way up to the peak, which I've got at about 90%. So that range they say is 85 to 95%. So now here's what's interesting. Everyone says that you're gonna burn more calories or burn more fat using high intensity interval training. But let's look at this real quick. So let's say that we burn about 10 calories a minute. Okay, so let's put that up here. 10 calories a minute times 30 minutes. We get 300 calories. So now we come over to our HIIT training. On our peaks here, we're gonna burn about 15 calories a minute. And our low points, we're gonna burn about 5 calories a minute. So with equal intervals, meaning when we talked in the beginning about the ratio of these highs to lows, if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, if we were to average this out between 15 calories a minute versus 5 calories a minute, how many calories a minute do we get? 10 calories a minute. So now, here's what's interesting about it. If you were to do the 1-to-2 ratio, meaning so every minute, let's say, of high intensity, you were to do 2 minutes of rest, that even lowers your average even more, so you're gonna burn even less calories that way. So as you can see, you can either do a constant at a moderate tempo, or you can do super high intensity with your intervals of lower intensity. But at the end of the day, it ends up burning about the same amount of calories. So if you take the EPOC equation out of it, because that's the argument for HIIT training, that you're going to burn more calories post-exercise, we know that it's not really more efficient when it comes to time. We know that we're not going to really burn more calories in that same period of time. So what's the real advantage of HIIT training versus steady state cardio? Well, at the end of the day, it's not about which one is more effective for burning fat. They're both going to work. Steady state cardio is going to burn fat. High intensity interval training is going to burn fat. A lot of it's going to come down to how else you're training. So let's look at some other factors here. If you're doing 5 days a week of weight training, especially with some intensity, doing 3 days a week of HIIT training is going to be taxing on your system. It's going to make recovery that much harder. So if you're doing hard weight training plus dieting on top of it, HIIT training probably isn't your answer. And that's the reason why bodybuilders or physique competitors traditionally do steady state cardio. You always wonder, if HIIT training is so much superior, why is it that your elite level physique and bodybuilders are doing steady state cardio? And that's because they're training hard. And a lot of the benefits that someone is getting out of HIIT training, you actually also get with weight training. So that's one of the reasons why you see these guys doing steady state cardio. So now, conversely, let's say that you don't want to weight train 5 days a week and you're only interested in burning fat and you're looking for something that's efficient, you can get in there and you can power through a workout. Well, that's where high intensity interval training really comes in. So with that being said, I'm still not telling you that steady state cardio is the only way to go. I still utilize HIIT. Later on, we'll talk about how I mix the two together. But I still think there's another layer to this that it's important to explain so you guys really understand the differences between HIIT versus steady state. So let's jump into that now. So there are 3 metabolic pathways in how your body creates energy for an activity. So let's talk about that just for a second, because it's relevant to what type of cardio you want to do under what type of conditions. So the first pathway, ATP. We don't need to get into the science of it. We'll try to keep it as simple as possible. But at the end of the day, ATP, that is for that immediate energy need. It's only for 15-second bursts of energy. So let's say that you're bursting out of, the blocks doing a sprint. That's ATP. Utilizes creatine phosphate as the primary source of fuel. So our second type is anaerobic. So when we talked about HIIT training and we started to move into more anaerobic, that's going to be this category right here. Well, at the end of the day, it means that we're using glucose as a source of fuel. So glucose is stored as glycogen in your muscles and in your liver. So this is going to be short-term energy. So that's that 1 to 3 minutes of activity. So then we move over to aerobic. This is going to be your long-term, so prolonged activity. This is where we're primarily using lipids as a source of fuel. You're also going to be using glucose as well. Now, before the popularity of HIIT, this is why people always talked about steady state cardio, and the advantages of doing steady state cardio is because it primarily uses lipids or fats as a source of fuel. So that was that old original argument. And then through time, through some of these other studies, that's when everyone started jumping on this HIIT bandwagon. But there's definite advantages of using steady state cardio. So why do I bring this up? Well, you remember also in that other chart, we talked about type 1 muscle fibers, we talked about type 2 muscle fibers. Well, this is important for a couple reasons. One, type 1 muscle fibers, your endurance muscle fibers, can utilize lipids as a source of fuel. In other words, can use fat as a source of fuel. So when we talk about endurance athletes, you hear them talking about being able to utilize fats as a source of energy. And this is why some of these endurance athletes start going on keto diets. So your endurance fibers, type 1 fibers, are using lipids as a source of fuel. So when you're doing steady state cardio, that's what you're using primarily is type 1 muscle fibers. So they're able to utilize fat as a source of fuel. Now, when we move over into higher intensity exercise, so whether that's HIIT training or even weight training, those type 2 muscle fibers, those are your explosive or fast twitch muscle fibers. Those are also the ones that grow bigger. So bodybuilders, that's what you're really training, is those type 2 muscle fibers. They prefer glucose as a source of fuel. So when we start doing HIIT training, we start moving more into anaerobic over here, where your body starts using glucose as a source of fuel. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth between the two in HIIT training. So that's why when we're talking about carb cycling, and that's what I'm really leading into here, because I follow a carb cycling program, you're using 2 different metabolic pathways depending on the type of training you're doing, but also depending on your diet. So how do I fit that into my program? Low carb days. So when you're on a low carb day, it's very difficult to do HIIT training. Why? Well, because you're using type 2 muscle fibers in HIIT training, which like to use glucose as a source of fuel. So when we're on a low carb day and I'm already trying to squeeze in weight training, when those type 2 muscle fibers want glucose as a source of fuel, and now I'm going to stack HIIT training on top of that, doesn't work so well. So that's why on low carb days, I want to come over here and I want to do more aerobic training and use those type 1 or endurance muscle fibers so I can use fats as a source of fuel. So on a carb cycling program, low carb days, that's why I do steady state cardio. Now on a high carb day where I've replenished my glycogen stores, that's where if I want to, I can bring some HIIT training back into the equation and maybe accelerate my fat loss using some HIIT. So I'm still using my steady state cardio as a foundation, but I can bring the HIIT on those high carb days, because again, we know that when we're doing HIIT, we're using those fast twitch muscle fibers, which are more anaerobic. So that's why I wanted to explain to you guys these 3 metabolic pathways, because it's relevant to your nutrition plan as well. So when you go back and you look at some of this original data on HIIT training versus steady state, that's the problem. You can't just take that information and apply it broadly to all situations, because it really depends on what kind of weight training you're doing and what your diet looks like. So to just, have this blanket statement that HIIT training is more effective for fat loss simply isn't true. It really just depends on those other variables and what your goal is. So that's why I felt it was important to explain the differences between these metabolic pathways. So to answer your question, what type of training do? I do steady state training on my low carb days, and there's 2 ways you can do it. And it really, again, goes back to how fast you want to lose fat and what your tolerance is for losing muscle. Because remember, the faster you try to lose fat, the greater the chance of losing lean muscle. So that's why the slow and steady approach is always going to be much better when you're trying to preserve lean muscle. That's where I would come in and I would do steady state. But for me, I don't want to risk losing muscle, and I'm not in a position right now where I have to hurry up. So that's where I'm just going to come in. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do my steady state cardio after my workout. So here's the advantage of that. In my weight training session, I'm going to utilize a lot of glucose as a source of fuel to power those type 2, those fast twitch muscle fibers through my weight training session. So I've already depleted my glycogen stores slightly in that workout. Now when I come in after the fact, right after, and I do my cardio, do my steady state cardio, I'm forcing my body to use fats as a source of fuel because I don't have as much stored glucose as a readily available source of fuel. So me personally, I like to do my cardio directly after my workout. Now, here's something that most people don't think about, but cardio, whether it's steady state or HIIT, isn't my primary driver for losing body fat. So I know that sounds kind of weird. Let me explain. The primary way that I lose body fat is through my metabolism. How do you boost your metabolism? Lean muscle. That's how you boost your metabolism. Muscle burns calories. So here's where I think people go wrong. They have this mindset that in order to lose fat, they've got to create a caloric deficit. Well, what happens when you create a caloric deficit? Well, there's a good chance in the process you're going to end up losing muscle. Well, muscle is your metabolic engine, so to speak. So as you lose muscle, you also lose your ability to burn calories. So that's why you'll hear bodybuilders talk about eating into a diet, and they actually eat more calories in a diet than they might in the off season. Well, how does that work? How can you eat more calories and lose fat? Well, that's because they're building up their metabolism. They're eating more frequently on a schedule, getting their body conditioned to expect that meal. So the body starts to ramp up the metabolism. A good example, I would almost compare it to water consumption. Your body's all about self-preservation. So if you went into the desert and you didn't have any water, what's your body going to do? Well, it's going to hold on to water. It's not going to excrete it. You're not going to sweat as much. You're not going to pee as much. It's almost counterintuitive. So if you want to drop water weight, you don't stop drinking water. You drink more water and you keep drinking water consistently and frequently. And then your body says, hey, it's okay. I'm getting plenty of water. It's okay to let this water go. Well, your metabolism is similar. Again, your body's all about self-preservation. So if your body doesn't know when it's getting that next meal, it's going to say, hey, let me slow things down here. Let me slow down the metabolism. I don't want to burn too many calories here because I don't know when I'm going to get more food. It's also going to try to store fat. Why? Fat is just energy reserve. So your body's saying, hey, don't know when I'm getting another one. Let me store this for later just in case. Now, if you do the opposite, if you start eating consistently, frequently, on a schedule, and start ramping up your metabolism, your body says, hey, it's okay. I know I'm getting meals frequently, consistently. It's okay. Let me start freely burning calories. So that's building up your metabolism. And that ultimately is what's going to help you burn body fat. So you can do all the cardio in the world that you want, but that's why it's important to go ahead and make sure that you eat right, get the proper amount of calories every day. But the other component to that is clearly the weight training. You've got to build the muscle. So it's all about going into the gym. It's about training hard, eating right, getting enough macronutrients. Then you're just supplementing all that with the cardio. I don't look at cardio as that singular way to burn body fat. It's a more of a combination of all those things. It's the weight training plus the nutrition plus the cardio. So at the end of the day, if you're asking me, okay, so steady state versus HIIT, what do you think is more effective? You know, I'm going to leave that up to you guys, but I'll leave you with one last thought, and that's this, that if the argument is that you can burn more calories in a shorter period of time with HIIT versus having to do steady state for a long period of time, let's look at the numbers real quick here. So if we were to do 40 minutes of steady state cardio, assuming that 10 calories a minute like we talked about earlier, that's 400 calories. So plus our 7% afterburn, that puts us at 428 calories for 40 minutes, okay? Because that's always the argument, right? That you have to do so much more steady state than you would have to do with HIIT. So we're only talking about doing 10 minutes more steady state cardio than HIIT. Now remember, this is just at a moderate intensity. You could honestly do this for an hour if you wanted to. To do 30 minutes of HIIT the right way at that 85 to 95% at those peaks is very, very difficult. Trust me, it's very difficult. So 30 minutes of HIIT, that's an ass kicker, okay? So 30 minutes of HIIT is going to give you the 300 calories at 14% afterburn. That's 342 calories. So whether HIIT is more effective for burning fat, which technically it is. Technically, you're going to burn more fat with the same, if it's all things are equal in time, so 30 minutes and 30 minutes, you're going to burn more fat, but you're also having to work your ass off to do this. It's much harder and at a point of diminishing return. as far as energy expenditure and recovery time, especially when you factor that in with the extra amount of weight training that you're doing and possibly even adding a diet into that as well, making this to do on a regular basis multiple times a week very difficult. Matter of fact, probably counterproductive because you're really going to slow down your recovery process. So just adding in an extra 10 minutes here, so that's not all this extra time like people paint it out to be. Just doing an extra 10 minutes, you can see you're getting 428 calories there. So look, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other. Again, I said it in the very beginning, I just want to give you guys some different information than what's out there and let you come to your own conclusion as to what's better for you. Again, if you're not doing any weight training, then maybe HIIT is for you. Especially, some people just like HIIT. My wife, Nick, loves HIIT. She hates steady state. Actually, with that being said, I hate steady state too. It's boring. That's the downside. It's really boring. For her, she loves HIIT. It's fun. It's exciting. She can do it outside in the backyard. She can go do it in the park. She can go do it wherever she wants. She doesn't need a treadmill. She doesn't need an elliptical. So that's one of the advantages. She loves HIIT training, and she does a lot more HIIT than she does weight training. So she only mixes in a small amount of weight training. I do the opposite. I do a lot of weight training, and so then I end up just supplementing that with some steady state cardio. So it goes back to the very beginning. It depends on where you're at, what your goal is, what your time frame is, and more importantly, what you enjoy doing. I think that's the biggest factor, and that's the takeaway message for this is don't let the studies skew your opinion as to which one's more effective. It's not about effectiveness. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to preference, which one you prefer and which one fits in to everything else you're doing when it comes to your training and your nutrition. So I hope this helps you guys. I'm sure there'll be plenty of unanswered questions here, and this will probably also spark up some debate. There'll probably be plenty of people that disagree with this, but I encourage you to go do your own research. Go look at some of those studies, those original studies that I talked about, the one from Baylor College, the one from Tallahassee, the one from Quebec. Go look at them. Go look at some of the parameters, the participants involved, and I think that you'll have a different perspective on it because you'll see that was kind of a little bit in a vacuum. It wasn't factoring in some of these other variables like what kind of weight training you do or what kind of nutrition plan you're following. So again, just to make that general statement that HIIT is superior, that's an unfair statement. So again, do your own research, think for yourselves. Don't take someone else's word for it because there's a lot of misinformation in the fitness industry. That's one of my pet peeves. That's one of the reasons why I do these videos is because I feel that it's my responsibility to, share a different perspective on it, because when I start seeing the same information regurgitated over and over, I think that perpetuates bad information. And, so you can't always just take that at face value. It's important to go out there and think for yourself, make decisions for yourself, and find the right program that works for you, because we're not all built the same way. We don't all have the same goals. We don't enjoy the same things. So you have to find what works for you and what works for your situation. So hope that helps, and I will talk to you guys soon.